Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Diversity Podcast with George Simons. So, George, what is this episode about today?
Well, this episode today is about the confusion that we have when we're trying to deal with how people are, on one hand, collective and on the other hand, individualistic. A long-standing problem to resolve in intercultural work, and a problem that we're going to put some good ideas into, we hope.
Okay, enjoy.
I want to start with where I come from in this. As you know, I was born in the USA, but my parents and grandparents were basically culturally immigrants from Eastern Europe, more or less Central and Eastern Europe. And I grew up very much with a sense of if everybody takes care of everybody else, everybody gets taken care of. But that was right in the middle of Western Reserve USA, where the strong Anglo tendency was to say, and still is, if everybody takes care of themselves, everybody gets taken care of. Now, I find that when we speak about individualism and then speak about collectivism, we're talking about theoretical categorizations of people, which at best can be somehow indicative of thinking and behavior. They're part of the more essentialist look at culture, which means that they can give us some interesting hints, but we can't rely on them to define people either as individuals or groups, ethnicities or countries or whatever. Now, that is also an issue because part of the problem with intercultural work these days is it's basically Western-oriented, and the very concepts need to be decolonized in order to work with them. What do I mean by that? We need to stop thinking in those categories as primary, quick thinking activities when we're dealing with people. Now, what does that really mean? Well, if you say individualistic, what are the kinds of things that you think and do and basically feel are within totally with or more totally within the domain of your own decision making, as opposed to things that you think and do which you decide upon by reflecting more deeply on the connections that you have with the people in the group or context that you happen to be working in or interacting in at the point. What's that mean? Well, it means that depending on the context, I may be very, very individualistic, giving my own opinion, strongly bearing on this sort of stuff, contesting perhaps a more general opinion which seems to be in the room. On the other hand, there are places where, we talk about Americans being, U.S. Americans, being individualistic. Well, yes, sometimes that philosophy of everybody takes care of themselves is the dominant element in a context. On the other hand, you can find 1,000 ways in which Americans behave like sheep, politically, socially, group-wise, and so on. So it's not a matter of labeling people as individualistic or as group-oriented people, but rather as what do I bring forth in this context and how do I use it? So if the context is very social and collaborative and we are looking toward everybody's opinions and we feel that the group we belong to has its strong opinions and its strong stories and we abide by those, okay, then we may behave in what we call a collectivistic fashion. On the other hand, if the group is not that way, or the situation is not to your ability to, or your willingness to go in the direction of the group, then you say, okay, that's individualistic behavior.
Yeah.
I like to think of individualistic expression and behavior as opposed to individualistic people.
Mm-hmm.
Now, granted that you or I may be more strongly inclined to maintain our position in certain contexts and in other contexts not. So that makes you more individualistic or collaborative or collectivistic than me. So we've got to get rid of these labels of people and look at what's the story they're telling themselves about how do I behave most effectively in this environment, in this group, for the good of myself and the other people involved in the group. So I just need to back off with that, because it becomes a label and even a way of naming people that I find very, very uncomfortable. And I'm sure that we'll have discussions and other topics regarding the kind of dimensional thinking that belong to the essentialist bend or turn in intercultural work. And as you all know, we're working now with much more cognitive science and using what the neurological research is showing us about how we function and make decisions and so on and so forth. So there's some use in knowing what kinds of things are commonly expected in a group, or, whether the group is your football fan club or your country, but the bigger the group, the less likely it's possible to find strong. Depends on the group, but you get a political party which is perhaps enormously collective in what it professes, and it's not even the people belong to it for some identity reason, and it may not be for that reason. Okay, so.
But it may be for another reason.
Well, the thing we're learning from neuroscience is we make decisions based on how we feel something belongs to our identity. And our identity is more than one element, it's a big story, okay? So if it may fit here, but not so well here, but if in order to be part of this here, we need to maintain something which is not so big a part of us, but will behave or think in that way in a certain context. The things we've been studying recently in terms of populism and dictatorship and so on, and challenges to democracy are very much related to who do we connect with, who says I'm you, and where our identity is linked, and therefore XXX are the consequences of how we're going to behave politically, how we're going to create laws, and so on and so forth. And of course these divisions can be big or they can be small, but what we see is a lot of people protecting their identities or different identities by the groups that they belong to. And identity is the big issue here. How deep is my belonging to a group? If you belong to a group that is relatively isolated, it may be that you are very much in line with more individualistic expression or more collectivistic expression, and will maintain that. But in a world today where we have so many different groups crisscrossing, globalization taking place, and so on, this becomes more and more difficult to maintain. So we create multiple aspects to our identities to allow us to be what we need and get what we need in different environments.
Yeah. So we have individualistic and collectivistic behavior. And have you been to places where you really notice this behavior more towards, except for the United States, maybe more towards a collectivistic side?
Well, both individualistic and collectivistic, part of this has to do with the story and the values. The thing that's coming into my mind was, it was about 11:30 p.m. and I was walking in downtown Zurich in Switzerland, okay? And I came to a street, and you could have shot a cannon down this crossroads in either direction and wouldn't have hit anything. There wasn't any traffic, whatever. The light was red. I crossed against the red light. The woman on the other side of the street said, "Sir, you should not cross against the light. Think of our children." Not a child in sight, only her, okay? But I was given a lesson of behaving in line with a group story, which she wanted me to be part of. It wasn't my group story, okay? And I mean, once upon a time I had a course in doing this sort of stuff, and students made little videos. And an American student was crossing a street, okay? Was getting ready to cross the street, and the light was red. So she's looking at the light, waiting for it to read, and a French woman with her basket goes right across the street, and she looks at her weirdly, you know, and then another guy comes along, and then finally, and she could cross the street because the light changed.
Uh-huh.
Okay, so this has to do with what's the story, what's the consequences, what's the meaning of various behaviors and how you need to adhere to them depending on where you're at. But I really got a kick out of that. I mean, I couldn't see a car any place except one parked across the street.
Yeah.
And I had to wait for the light to change for her to be happy.
So you would say that for her it's important to follow the rules, and following the rules, is that a collectivistic trait then?
Well, it depends on the collectivism.
Yeah.
Now I'll give you the difference. Remember I said we made videos, and it was the American who would not flex the rule of crossing the street, but the French people walked right on by her and crossed the street, and then finally, oh, okay, I can cross the street now.
Yeah.
So, we are in a time where we have to carefully look at all the categorizations we make and realize that they are, you know what? They're categorizations. They're not reality. They're tendencies which we seem to observe and seem to acknowledge and may be useful in certain circumstances because they might have statistically a bearing on the group that we're dealing with, but excuse me. So it's very important. I just have lots of trouble with individualistic versus collectivistic, because I say, oh, look, that's it, collectivistic behavior, and then 2 minutes later the person is doing something, oh my God, and it's according to my stories about what works in those contexts. So we're thrown back on the storytelling issue of what is my story, what is my role, what do I need to best do to succeed and survive in this environment. So if I'm like you and as a student in Japan, the conversations may be different, and you tend to label them as more collectivistic, and yet we also hear lots of reports of this breaking down in places that have long been labeled collectivistic. We're not talking about them being so collectivistic, or we're blaming it on the younger generation that these things are falling apart, okay? But it's not the younger generation. I think it's the exposure to the bigger and bigger world that we have, which is encouraging us to do other things than the basic stories that we may have been brought up with. You know?
Yeah, it's funny what you say about the red light, because when I was in Japan, in a very small village, and we did have these traffic lights, of course, and people were waiting, but I felt, normally in the Netherlands I walk the red light. I don't really know, everyone does, but here nobody did. And I felt this group behavior. It was really difficult for me to go against this group behavior. Everyone was waiting, but there was no cars coming, no cars in sight. So I was like, oh, I guess I'll just wait with the group then.
Yeah, well, see, there's another consideration here, and that is what works in the environment you're in, okay? While for you and for me, crossing the street against the red light, if there's no traffic, may not cause any qualm whatever. If you have changed the context and you're in a place where it's important to people, then it's not about labeling you as individualistic or them as collectivistic. It's saying, what's this environment ask of me? And let me add that to my repertoire of behavior, okay? Now, there are places where, of course, our behavioral repertoire may come into strong conflict with our feelings about it, but that's one of the challenges of becoming really culturally competent, is realizing your own boundaries, stories, resistances, desires, and so on, and then knowing when you move to another context that you may have to explore those or do them differently, or do them in the way that the people there do them rather than the way you do them. I mean, simple things like eating an ice cream cone on the street, or a sandwich on the street,
or eating on the street in the first place.
That's what I mean. Just eating on the street, it can be disturbing to people in some group contexts, and on the other hand, it may be normal where you come from. So I think there's something else involved in this that I think is very important to notice. Okay, how we have a need for our identity to fit, be honored, and express itself. Okay, now you say, okay, I'm a member of a football fan club. Okay, so what goes into that? Maybe a story about the town I love that has this team. It may have my connection to how these people play, these really great players that we have. And so I go around and I cheer for my team and boo for the other team, And then when the game's over, if we lost, I go and break windows in the town. See? So in other words, we are I almost want to say the victims of our identity stories, right? And the ability to deal with people very different from ourselves, or in a different culture, or even in our family, depends on our being culturally competent, which means knowing my story well enough, realizing that somebody else may have a different story, and learning to, in context with that person, be able to decide that I'll think this way and behave this way because it seems like it'll be the best thing for what I want to accomplish, have, the relationship, and so on. So it's about identity, big about identity, and the various stories that I have that allow my identity to be adapted wherever I happen to be, or the context that happens to emerge where I am. Mm-hmm. If that makes sense, that's the way I think of it.
Makes sense. So basically, it's not all black and white. You can't say, "Oh, you are so individualistic now," or maybe they have traits, or maybe they have certain behavior, but it's a mix.
They have a story by which they behave.
Yeah.
And now, there are places where people's stories really, really conflict. And that's where we learn, that's where we have to pay our attention to developing the skills of conflict resolution. You know, I teach a course in negotiation, and one of the first analyses that we do is what are the ways of dealing with conflict. Okay, you've got a conflict, all right? How do you go about dealing with it? You can slug it out, have a war, okay? Doesn't really do a good job of resolving the conflict, because at the end of a war, the loser's claim is always, we'll be back, we'll be back. Okay, so then I can compromise, okay? I try to give as much as I can, and you try to give as much as you can to meet the needs that we have in the situation. Doesn't mean that we're going to agree on anything, but it depends on how much flexibility do I have to be able to do this, okay? Then, of course, there's the possibility of resolving conflict by just following the rules of the boss. Now, that has its advantages and disadvantages. If the boss is really savvy, and I may disagree, I might be more inclined to say, let me see what the boss is saying and how we go about it, And on the other hand, if I'm the person with the information, and the person I'm dealing with is the person with the information, then we don't go to the boss. We find a way of discussing, debating, negotiating it with each other. So, and there's a half a dozen other ways to resolve conflicts. Sometimes we resolve conflicts by just giving in. And when is that? Well, we don't do that if it's a really, really important thing for us. But we may do it for the sake of a relationship, a friendship, and so on and so forth, Honey, have it your way, in a relationship. And, or, how are we going to resolve this? What are we going to do tonight?
Yeah.
It's always an interesting question among friends and partners.
And when you have a culture that is very, in general, very individualistic, and a culture that is very collectivistic, when they connect, when they work together, does then a conflict occur?
Well, the question is, do we learn to be transparent and communicate effectively? Okay. We need to keep each other up to date. Okay. If all of a sudden I expect that you're going to do this on Wednesday, and you say, and I'm getting ready, I'm saying, well, what time do I pick you up tomorrow? And then you say, oh, I've decided to go on Friday. Okay. That may be a jolt to me. And that may be a common way of behavior with you, but I think, when we come to collaborative resolution of decisions, we definitely need to communicate. That's why we're into the storytelling business at this point when it deals with culture. I need to know what's going on for you. Why is that okay for you and it wasn't okay for me to change the date? I mean, some people are very planned out, and other people are loosey-goosey, with this stuff.
I can just imagine someone from a culture where, okay, so walking a red light, for instance, like they come to the Netherlands and they must be shocked because everyone walks a red light there.
Could be, yeah. And this, of course, depends on the diversity of the population. If I'm coming from the USA, there are people with backgrounds like mine that are from Eastern and Southern European, where connectivity seems more important in certain situations. And then there are people who, I'm for me. If you're for you, you get everything you need in life, So that's the story that they're telling themselves about how life works. And, when a whole group of, something we'll talk about another time, but when a whole group of people belongs to the same story, we call that a meta-narrative. It's common sense, what people think is common sense. But common sense is common to the group that it's common to. It's not common necessarily anyplace else.
And that's what you have to communicate.
And that's what you need to communicate. You need to tell the story, why it's important for you, or what you're concerned about, or whatever, you know. It was very interesting today. Remember, we have a colleague who was here working with us this morning, and she got up after our discussion, and she got to the door, and I started asking her a couple of other things, and she let me know where she was coming from. What she said was, she said, George, I want you to know that every time I have a discussion with you and I get up to go and I'm at the door, halfway out the door, you're saying to me, oh, about something else I want to, or can you, you know, and I will tag on 2 or 3 things that may or may not relate to the discussion we've had, but she's saying, I want to hear those in the discussion, and when it's time for me to get up, say goodbye, and close the door, I don't manage stuff well when it comes at me, and I'm in the motion of doing something else. Totally legitimate. That's the way she is, and the way I am is, oh yeah, hey, and another thing, on your way, you know, interruptions like that. So it's interesting because I think it, you know, we're talking about individualism and collectivism. We can start taking those categories. The category system needs to be taken apart, okay, so that we realize that categories are at best have some statistical reality, but remember, you're not a statistic, I'm not a statistic, and I can't apply a statistic to you until I know what's going on, or you to me, unless I let you know what's going on for me. And of course, she very clearly, very politely let me know what was uncomfortable for her in my behavior.
Yeah.
Now, I have to rewire my system for contexts with her that I stop doing that sort of thing, okay? I may do it with you. Well, I don't know. You haven't told me yet, but, you know, then I do it with her, and it's something else.
Yeah, she communicates what she means by getting up and opening the door. That's the end of the conversation.
So I'm sure you can create a category for me. I don't know what the category for somebody who blah, 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 blah is on is, but on the other hand, very different from her closing the conversation, setting her mind to what's next, and leaving, as opposed to me, oh, and, yeah, oop.
Yeah. Yeah. Meta-narratives.
Yeah, well, it's also, what we're really doing is sort of decolonizing our individualistic mentality. You know, I was mentioning the fact that colonialism was an expression of assumed superiority over a group of people or a geographical region where people were considered totally nil, and they had to become like us, the colonizers, in order to have value, and would utterly destroy beautiful cultures, or at least put them in abeyance until they were able to get back on their own 2 feet, which is, I mean, not that people don't learn something from the colonizers, but on the other hand, the sense of correctness, superiority, our way is the best, you're dumb and we're smart. And seeing that as a responsibility of those who are the colonizers. They see it as their own responsibility to fix other people. I think I mentioned to you in some other conversation, if you read the newspapers from around the Mexican-American War, you see that the newspapers were clamoring about, well, we can take all of Mexico, and another voice in there was saying, we cannot take all of Mexico because we cannot absorb so many inferior people.
Wow.
Okay? So, I mean, while it would have been potentially, at least, militarily and governmentally achievable, the idea of these are all these inferior people, we can't let them be free in our country and part of our country. You know?
That was in the newspaper.
And those were newspaper headline editorials and stuff like that.
Yeah.
Lots of stuff like that back then. You know,
Yeah.
and the same thing. One of our colleagues is working on the work of immigration and acculturation, and it's also a frightful thing to look at the fact that you look back at the big days of immigration into the United States. Not that they're necessarily over with, but as the United States was forming, there were waves of Germans that came, waves of Italians, waves of Poles, waves of Chinese from the out west, and the gold rush and all that other sort of stuff. Well, with all of these people coming, we have a whole variety of approaches to what we do and how we do, but all of them were looked upon as inferior. Frequently, their admission was legislated against. There was laws against Chinese immigration, laws against different kinds of immigration in various places throughout the years. That's not something new with Donald Trump.
Yeah. Yeah, that is difficult for a group to accept a new group.
And to ultimately, what kind of culture emerges in a multicultural society?
Yeah.
Well, pretty broken up sometimes. I mean, in order to preserve themselves, the newcomers created their world here. In other words, I remember German and Slovenian banking systems for the local people. They created their own banks, they created their own things, created their own schools. So it's about identity. Identity is the real issue here, and most of the things that we think of as dimensions are simply various ways in which identity may express itself and engage with other identities.
Oh. That's pretty good. I like it.
Yeah, it's a big topic, and I think we only scratched the surface, but I think the most important thing that I'm concerned about is that we do not let categories become absolutes.
Yeah.
We're in a different world psychologically today.
Yeah.
And at the same time, people are protecting their identities like crazy.
Oh. Yeah, I think that's good for today.
Yeah.
What should we talk next about? We can do, I like the meta-narratives thing.
Okay.
Yeah. Okay, thank you
We'll
for
go
listening.
Thanks, folks. Enjoy life and tell each other your stories. Thank you very much for listening. It's a great opportunity to share our perspectives with each other. And if you're interested in raising more questions or have ideas about topics that you'd like to see addressed in this podcast series, don't hesitate to make a note and let us know in the responses below. Thanks. Bye-bye.